Welcome to our Adolescent Eating Disorders Seminar webinar. My name is Jennifer Rinks, and I serve on the Board of Directors of the Marin Healthcare District. We're so glad you could join us. As you may know, eating disorders affect more than 30 million people in the U.S. They affect all genders, races, and ethnic groups, and can have a significant negative impact on someone's health, emotions, and abilities to function in life. That's why it's so important to understand the signs, the resources that are available, and what steps you can take. We'll open up our seminar with a talk from Dr. Marin, our featured guest speaker. She's going to help us learn how to identify eating disorders and understand what resources are available to help so that you and your child can return to healthier eating habits and healthier life. After her talk, we'll open it up to questions from the audience, including those who are here in person and those attending virtually. In addition to this, we have some handouts for you in the back of the room, which include a list of resources. For those of you attending virtually, we'll send you the handouts by email immediately following today's presentation. Before we get started, let me introduce you to our guest speaker, Dr. Marin Accurso. She is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health Sciences at UCSF, where she also serves as the clinical director of the UCSF Eating Disorders Program. Her focus is on the treatment of eating disorders with the goal of improving access to evidence-based care for diverse youth with eating disorders. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marin Accurso to the stage.
Thank you so much, and really wonderful to be here and really excited to have a chance to speak with everyone and hopefully share some information, and as questions come up, try my best to help provide some additional information. So today I'm really going to be focused on what parents should know about eating disorders and try to provide some background information that may be helpful for people as they're considering this topic. Okay, I did want to start out with some disclaimers. I don't specialize in really young children who can have pretty significant feeding disorders. I'm going to focus mostly on older children, teens, and young adults. I myself am continuing to learn and make lots of mistakes along the way, but do my best to present information that will be helpful for people here. One thing that I really want to emphasize is that each child and family is unique. And so some of the principles that I'm going to talk about today may apply in unique ways to each individual family unit. And so just being mindful that some of these things, depending on different cultural, different background factors, may look a little bit different in each family. And so being mindful of that. We all also come to the table with our own family backgrounds, our own upbringings, our own culture, various types of life experiences that really influence our beliefs about food, about eating, about body, and behaviors that impact how we parent and what we think is, the quote-unquote right way to parent, which none of us will ever probably achieve, but awareness of all of these things really evolves over time. And so I just want to be really mindful that, a lot of the experiences that you may have had to date and some of the information that you may have heard up to this point may have led you to have really strong beliefs about, which way to go. And part of what I'm going to do is present some information, some of which may be new, some of which may be really consistent with what you've heard before. And so if you experience any confusion or, kind of dissonance, like feeling that the information may be very different than what you've heard, just keeping an open mind, and I'll be really welcome questions as you're thinking through some of these different topics. And then finally, really having some self-compassion. This is a really key skill across all parts of life, but especially in parenting. We all really want the best for our children. We all make mistakes along the way. And so just having some self-compassion when those things come up. Okay. So general outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. We'll talk a little bit about some of the different influences on our various beliefs and behaviors in the realm of nutrition, of eating, and also of body image. We'll talk about some classic eating disorder risk and warning factors. We'll discuss some of the principles that we think about in terms of how to help people really build a healthier body image, a healthier relationship with their body, with food, with eating. And then we'll save some time at the end for some questions and discussion. Okay, So just to start out, what is healthy eating? We really think about healthy eating as having a lot of flexibility in food choices. So not all of these rigid rules, but really being able to eat flexibly in different types of settings with different types of people, different types of food, not really seeing any particular foods as being off limits. So not having kind of this good and bad category of foods, but really being able to enjoy all ranges of food in a flexible and balanced way, and being able to tune into our own internal experiences of hunger and satiety. So is this a time when we feel hungry? What do we feel hungry for? Have I had enough? Do I feel satisfied in my body? And being able to really tune into that. And I think, if you think about kind of the beginning of life, this is everything that babies do, right? They're not thinking about, I've had too much, I've had too little, I haven't had the right type of nutrition. They're just responding to those cues in a really natural and beautiful way. And as we, grow older, I think there's lots of thinking and talk around what's the right food and what's enough food and what's, good eating or bad eating. And so sometimes we can get a little bit disconnected from those cues over time. But if we think about, again, kind of starting at infancy, infants are born knowing how to do this. And they just respond and they kind of demand what they want at the time that they want it. And we think about healthy eating in a really similar way where we're really tuned into our bodies and thinking about, listening to those internal hunger cues rather than a bunch of external cues. And then no food is healthy when you aren't healthy about how you're eating it. So that's a really important principle in thinking about, healthy relationships with food and eating disorders in particular. If you're eating foods in such a rigid way or such a regimented way, or have so many rules around the food, even if the foods that you're eating are really nutritious and have a lot of health benefits, it's not really a healthy way of eating. Okay. I really like this quote by Ellen Satter, and I'm going to go ahead and read it so people have a chance to absorb some of what she says. Normal eating is going to the table hungry and eating until you are satisfied. It is being able to choose food you like and eat it and truly get enough of it, not just stop eating because you think you should. Normal eating is being able to give some thought to your food selection so you get nutritious food, but not being so wary and restrictive that you miss out on enjoyable food. It is leaving some cookies on the plate because you know you can have some again tomorrow, or it is eating more now because they taste so wonderful. Normal eating is trusting your body to make up for your mistakes in eating. Normal eating takes up some of your time and attention, but keeps its place as only one important area of your life. I really like this quote, and I really like some of what Ellen Satter has written about eating in general, because it really balances this approach of being able to eat something. Sometimes you feel like having more of those things, and that's normal. And your body, if you're listening to internal cues, will naturally adjust and not maybe give you the same type of hunger cues the next day because you've had more, a little bit more. Whereas when we think about eating disorders, and we'll talk about this more, people really start to apply oftentimes a lot of rules around how they eat, and that really interferes with their capacity to be in tune with what feels good, what's enough, what satisfies them, what's healthy, kind of in the whole balance of things. Okay, so what is disordered eating? Disordered eating is when our attitudes about food or weight or body size lead to very, very rigid ways of thinking about eating and actual eating behavior, very rigid ways of engaging in exercise, and these jeopardize our health, our happiness, and our safety. Okay, so I just want to contrast kind of what we've talked about in terms of healthy attitudes around eating and disordered eating and attitudes. So with healthy eating and attitudes, food is enjoyable. We enjoy it. I mean, that's one of the parts of food. It is also fuel, but it is also supposed to be fun. So food is fuel. Food is enjoyable. We have food flexibility. We're able to eat a range of different foods and be able to kind of switch between different types of foods in different types of settings. We don't experience guilt around eating or feel that we need to do something after eating because we've eaten a certain type of food. And we really trust our own physical cues and our own body. That's what we think about as kind of healthy eating attitudes, healthy eating patterns. Disordered eating and attitudes We often attach a value to food. It becomes kind of a good food or a bad food. And I think in our culture, this is actually pretty normalized, right? Especially, I think you'll hear in a lot of conversation, well, that's unhealthy, or that's junk food, or, this is super nutritious food, or this is really clean food, or really healthy food. And I think when we start attaching some of that moral value to food, it can get in the way, again, of people being able to approach food in a more flexible way. And with disordered eating, people often start to attach certain rules to only eating this type of food or that type of food, or certainly not eating those types of foods. And these kinds of rules really interfere, again, with our ability to eat in a balanced way, feel good about what we're eating, and enjoy being in social contexts where certain foods will be offered. There's often an attempt to control food intake, and being able to do that is sometimes kind of equated to a sign of virtue. Like I'm able to have the kind of moral capacity to not eat this thing that everybody else is eating, but I'm going to abstain from doing that. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that becomes so problematic and how that sets people up for either a really problematic change in terms of their capacity to intake nutrition and their weight, or sets them up for this pattern where they're engaging in really restrictive eating, and then they might lose control because foods feel so off limits. It's not really feasible for people to cut out these foods altogether, for the most part. Certainly not without a lot of distress and thinking and attention to it, or some consequences around that. Oftentimes there's pretty significant guilt around eating, especially if eating more than what one planned, or certain foods that, are not in the good category of foods. Rigid rules around eating. This diet culture is really, I think, become more strong in recent years and really prevalent in our society. And it's really equated with, kind of not doing certain things. Sometimes, people end up feeling really deprived. And then overuse of food can also be a coping strategy for people. And if people are relying a lot on food for comfort, or to regulate boredom or negative emotions, coping with stress, that can also become a problematic pattern. It's, I think, really normal and normative for all of us sometimes to experience food as really comforting. But when it becomes the primary mode of comfort, it can become problematic as well. Okay. So an eating disorder is really this abnormal eating pattern that compromises physical health, compromises emotional well-being, and you probably are familiar with many of these different eating disorders. Anorexia, where people often lose a pretty significant amount of weight, or on the other hand, are not gaining in the way that they should, not kind of staying on their growth trajectory, and become really, really fixated on kind of what they're taking in, or even if they know that they should be taking in more nutrition, they really have a very hard time doing that. They're often seeing their body in a really distorted way, not really understanding in reality kind of what their body looks like, and often engage in a lot of really specific rules around eating. Bulimia nervosa, we see a lot of the same type of thinking with bulimia, but people are also engaging in binge eating and purging behaviors like self-induced vomiting. We can also see this in anorexia, but the main difference between these two is kind of the amount of weight loss, or how underweight someone is relative to where they really should be based on their own personal individual health. Binge eating disorder, where people are engaging in really recurrent episodes of loss of control, where they start eating, they really can't stop eating, they eat way more than they intended to, and more than what would be typical in one sitting. And this behavior, can become really recurrent. And a lot of people think about binge eating disorder as, only loss of control, but actually a lot of what drives binges is some form of restriction, whether it's rules that are in place or, not eating for most of the day, and then someone will end up binging because their body is deprived and really drives them to do that. ARFID, which is kind of a little bit of a newer kid on the block in terms of eating disorders. This is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. These people with ARFID can look really different depending on their presentation, but these might be some of the kids with more picky eating. who only eat foods of a certain color or foods that are a certain texture, or they really just don't have that same appetitive drive that other people have, and so it's really hard for them to take in as much nutrition as they need. I won't spend as much time focusing on ARFID, but you're welcome to ask questions about that if that's of interest to you. Okay. So there was a really pretty recent review that came out of the kind of proportion of children with disordered eating, children and adolescents, and this was a very large study. So they looked at 32 different individual studies that included over 60,000 participants combined across 16 countries, and they found that 22% of those children and adolescents in kind of these community samples had disordered eating. And I say that kind of as a starting point because this is not something that's terribly uncommon. Sometimes people have the idea that eating disorders, they're kind of more rare or they don't happen that much. And that is to some extent true relative to anxiety and depression, where a lot more teens and young adults are experiencing those than are experiencing eating disorders. But we really see disordered eating across the board. And so it's pretty common, about 1 in 5 children and teens are experiencing some level of disordered eating. So if you're seeing some behaviors that you're concerned about, you're with a lot of other parents with children who might be concerned about some behaviors that they're seeing as well. And because these behaviors are they're really common, and kids talk about their bodies, and they talk about their eating habits a lot with each other, and so there is an influence of what's kind of appropriate within their peer group. We do know eating disorders affect all types of people, but they are more common in girls. They are more common as age increases, so more in older adolescents than younger kids and younger adolescents. And they are more common in people who have higher weights. Okay. So again, just some figures that are sort of striking. 40% of 9-year-old girls have dieted. It's a pretty large proportion. It's a little shocking when you think about kids who are 9, that they're something in their environment or something within them has sort of driven them to say, I should try to diet. Right, and most of these diets are with the intention of weight loss. That number goes up quite a bit when you move up to older teens, so 40 to 60% of high school girls have dieted. And, we hear things like, I can't eat that. I need to lose weight for this dance, or I need to lose weight for this competition, or I can't eat that because I'm on a diet. So a lot of kids have experimented with dieting. About half of kids in high school, half of girls in high school have experimented with dieting behavior. So many of you may be here for really different reasons, but I thought it might be helpful whether you want to fill this out about a child that you might be concerned about, or someone that you might kind of have in mind. And I'm going to give people a little bit of time in your packet of resources that were sent, or if you're here in person in your packet of materials, you have this measure. And it's maybe a couple of good things to be thinking about in terms of behaviors that you may be seeing that could be concerning, and we'll talk about what the results mean. These results are just for you. They're not for sharing with anybody else unless you want to do that. But I'll give people a little bit of a chance to read through these. And if you have a pen or pencil or a calculator where you can write things down, just note the number that you're circling for each of these items. So I'll give people a little bit of time to do these first 4, and then I'll put the next few up on the screen. Just to orient people to this measure as they're looking at it. It's really kind of your observation of a child in your life, and how they might be acting or thinking or feeling related to their eating and or their body. And the scale goes from never, you've never observed this behavior, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. I know everybody moves at their own pace, and you're welcome to finish this later. But just to orient people, if you've gotten through these 10 items, you're welcome to use a calculator or old school math to add these up and divide by 10. And for the families that we see, mostly parents of teens and children, for the ones who end up having an eating disorder diagnosis, the average score on this measure is about a 3, right? So that they're seeing most of these behaviors on average sometimes. And kids usually have really different reports from parents because they may not be endorsing some of these things, or they may, really be endorsing some of these things that may not be as visible to other observers. But it's just a helpful gauge if you are concerned, or you're seeing some behaviors or some attitudes, or you've heard your child say some things that have felt a little bit concerning. Some of the things on this measure can give you some clues as to what might be some of the things that we might be thinking about and looking for in assessing for eating disorders. And on average for kids with an eating disorder, parents, kind of the average score on this measure is a 3. So I would say if your score for your child that you're thinking about is somewhere near there or above that, and you haven't sought out extra help or resources, it's maybe a kind of a good marker that might be something that would be a good support for you. Okay. And then also thinking about some of the behaviors that you might be observing or that you might know about. So if you've observed any binge eating, in other words, you observe that your child seems to really lose control over their eating, eat a lot more than what somebody typically would in one sitting, or you're aware that they've engaged in some sort of compensatory behavior like self-induced vomiting or laxative use, those are usually pretty concerning behaviors. So those would definitely be markers that you may want to get some extra help if that's not available already. And then, exercising really hard or having really rigid rules about exercise. This one is a really tricky because, especially in our community, a lot of kids engage in sports in a really intensive way. And so some of this can be kind of, normal within their team or team culture. But when you see it really go outside of that realm, or the thinking around it seems much more intense than what would be expected, that might also be another clue that, there might be some cause for concern, and it's helpful just to start with a conversation about it. Okay. So just to review some myths, eating disorder myths. These are really common beliefs that people have about eating disorders. They only happen to girls. Right? It's just a phase, they'll get over it. I'm not concerned about it because it's going to change, and everybody's doing this right now, and so no need to really worry too much. It's all about attention. They're just trying to get someone's attention by engaging in these behaviors, and so if I just ignore them, they'll go away. They only happen in middle to upper class white families. People never really recover from an eating disorder. There's a pretty big myth that parents are to blame for eating disorders, and we know that that's not the case. And then there's also a myth that eating disorders are really caused by media. And I really want to address all of these, and that the causes for eating disorders are so multifactorial. There are so many things that are involved in someone developing an eating disorder. We really can't pinpoint a single cause. And we know that they don't just only happen to girls. It's not just a phase. It's not just about attention. They don't only happen to families that have more resources, that are affluent. And we do know that people can recover and do recover from eating disorders. So if you've heard any of these myths and you've bought into them, I really want to dispel these because they're not consistent with what we know from the data. Eating disorders transcend race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic status, body shape, and size. We really see eating disorders across the full range of any type of identity and background. And so it's really important to be aware of that and not think that, somebody who might be showing some concerning behavior does not have an eating disorder because they don't, quote unquote, look like they have an eating disorder. You really don't know. You don't know based on their personal factors, and you don't know based on their appearance. So if you're seeing something that's concerning, I think it's appropriate to be concerned, regardless of who the person is that you might be concerned about. There are also as many reasons why people develop eating disorders as there are people with eating disorders. So these factors are really dependent on the individual. Yes, there are some shared risk factors, and I can talk about those and share those with you so you have a sense of what those are, but there really is no single cause. And even within kind of an individual story of how their eating disorder developed, we know that it's usually not just as simple as how they conceptualize what happened. There are so many different factors involved. And genetics and biology is actually one of the biggest factors involved in the development of eating disorders. I think people often focus on, social kind of environment and media and all of these different, influences with peer groups and family, et cetera. Yes, all of those things can play a role, but actually eating disorders are highly genetic disorders. And so it's not that different from something like diabetes, where people are genetically more at risk for developing these things. So sometimes that's helpful for parents to hear because oftentimes when we have parents coming in concerned about their child, they may feel some level of responsibility for that. But in the same way that, you might be aware that you might pass on a cancer gene, but you probably don't internalize the responsibility around that in the same way as that sometimes happens for mental health. So I want to just also put that information there that, yes, there are many factors involved in the development of eating disorders. A big part of that is genetic. So taking a little bit of the onus kind of off whatever's happening in the environment around that. Okay. So there really are kind of these three buckets that cause eating disorders. There's the biological bucket, and that really is the biggest part. Estimates look at about 50 to 70% of eating disorder development as being, hereditary. There's obviously some psychological components. Kids with eating disorders typically have higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety. They may have had some changes, transitional changes in terms of what's going on for them at school. All of those things can, kind of create a perfect storm in combination with the social realm. Okay. So these are some of the established risk factors that we know about from many, many studies that have been done. Really frequent dieting or restrictive eating is one of the biggest, best established risk factors for the development of an eating disorder. And it doesn't really matter why the dieting or the restrictive eating came about. So we actually see a lot of young people who didn't go on a diet for any sort of body image related concern, but they were trying to become faster at track, or, they got sick, and then they had a really hard time kind of increasing their eating after their illness. Any sort of restrictive eating or weight loss or dieting behavior really puts people at increased risk for developing an eating disorder. And again, it doesn't really matter why it came about. It doesn't have to be somebody going on a diet specifically to lose weight or because they're trying to change something about their body. Just the act of restrictive eating puts people at increased risk of developing an eating disorder. And then on top of that, if people have really extreme preoccupation with their body weight or their shape, then that also is a pretty strong established risk factor for development of an eating disorder. Some things that we know are correlated with the development of an eating disorder and may potentially put people at increased risk of eating disorders is weight loss or failure to make weight gain. So again, sometimes we see this non-intentional. Somebody lost weight because of a variety of factors that really has nothing to do with them intentionally trying to lose weight, or sometimes kids fall off their growth curve, not because they're losing weight, but because they're growing in height and their weight doesn't really keep up with what we would expect their weight to do as they're kind of getting older and getting taller. And those things are often correlated with the development of an eating disorder. Compulsive exercise, if exercise becomes really regimented or really rule-bound, really tied to certain things that need to happen or really intensive, that can become a risk factor for eating disorders. And then obviously engaging in some of these, initial behaviors that are actually pretty common in teens, binge eating, purging, kind of trying that out can increase the risk of kind of someone developing a full-blown eating disorder. We see a lot of high levels of perfectionism in people with eating disorders. So these are often kids who they're really good at following rules, and they really like following rules. Oftentimes like things in kind of a black and white type of way. They like certainty. They are really able to follow through at a different level than maybe most of their peers. And so sometimes we see pretty high levels of people with kind of high levels of perfectionism who end up developing eating disorders. And it makes sense to some extent because if in the part of their eating disorder they have really specific rules around what they need to do to do it right, to eat right, to exercise right, if they're highly perfectionistic and they really hold that standard, then they're able to institute those rules in a really regimented way. But I would say for most people, again, going back to the biology, for most people, even if they're striving for not eating certain types of foods or only eating a certain amount of foods, they're really not able to sustain that over time. So you sort of have to have the biology, that's sort of the loaded gun, and then there's maybe some factors in the environment that pull the trigger. And then family history, and again, that goes back to genetics and biology as well, that if people have a family history of eating disorders within their family, then they're at higher risk for developing an eating disorder. Okay. Factors that increase risk, age. We know that most of the vast majority of eating disorders develop between ages of 12 and 25. Certainly we see eating disorders in kids who are much younger. Certainly we see the development of eating disorders in people who are much older than that. But mostly we see this happen during this period of time. And there's some research to suggest that the development of menarche and hormones can play a pretty big role as well in the development of eating disorders. And that, to some extent, can explain some of the gender differences that we see in eating disorders as well. So age is one big factor. Body image dissatisfaction or internalization of the thin ideal. And what I mean by that is, in our culture, we have really fixed beliefs around, what the ideal, quote unquote, ideal body should look like. And for the most part, especially for cisgender women, that's someone who's relatively slim, someone who's thin. And that ideal can be either highly internalized by someone or kind of rejected or not really become a part of what they embody. But when someone really internalizes that ideal as being something that they would want for themselves or something that they would strive for, that can increase risk for an eating disorder. Unfortunately, we see a lot of teasing, a lot of bullying in schools, even with young kids. I was just talking with another mom, kindergarten mom, who said, my kid came home and said, am I fat, Mom? Because kids at school called me fat. And I don't even know what that means. But am I fat? So these topics around weight, around body size, they come up really early. And kids sort of weaponize some of these concepts at a really early age. So being teased or criticized about weight is one thing that puts people at increased risk for an eating disorder, especially if they buy into kind of this internalization of the thin ideal. It makes them more susceptible to really feeling ashamed and bad about their body, like there's something wrong with them. There are certain sports and activities that really prioritize lower weight. So things like figure skating, ballet, dance, wrestling. Some of these sports can also be, put people at increased risk for developing an eating disorder because the number really does become such an important focus. We've had kids who come in who are doing track who, they were told to get to a certain weight because it'll make you faster, or they need to meet a certain weight class for wrestling, and so they were engaging in some really dangerous behaviors to make sure that they met that weight class. Those things, again, even if they're not driven by the person wanting to change their shape in any way, the drive to lose weight and the things that they engage to do that put them at high risk for becoming more chronic problems. Negative energy balance, this can be accidental. So what I mean by this is people are expending more energy than what they're taking in. Again, that sometimes this can happen with sickness. We do see young people who develop an eating disorder after a prolonged course of illness when they were really having trouble taking in nutrition. Again, no intention on their part at all to lose weight. Or sometimes we see young people with pretty significant GI complaints that, they were going through lots of different testing and they couldn't understand what was happening and having a lot of pain around eating. And then it actually develops into anorexia. And sometimes they're so confused by that because they say, but I didn't have the typical progression. It's not like I tried to lose weight. I didn't care about my body. I was happy with the way my body was. I would be happier if I gained some weight. But it becomes so hard for them to do that because a different type of thinking has taken over in the context of all of this weight loss. Often that happens. GI problems and infection can put people at increased risk for developing an eating disorder. We know that eating disorders are more common among LGBTQ plus individuals. I think gender identity can play a big role in how somebody feels about their body. There are different norms within kind of the gay and queer and lesbian communities that sometimes can be protective, but oftentimes can put additional stress on what bodies should look like. And then trauma, we know, is a pretty big factor that contributes to risk for eating disorders. I apologize about my voice. I had a cold about a month ago and I haven't totally recovered it, but hopefully everybody can hear. Okay. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about diet culture because it is all around us. So when we talk about dieting is a temporary change in eating habits, most often to lose weight or to maximize athletic performance or some other goal. And diet culture, when I talk about diet culture, what I mean is the kind of the normalizing that practice of eating. That dieting is normal, that it's, something that we all should be doing. And it's really prevalent in our society that it's, people talk about what diet they're on, what diet they've been on, what diet they're going to try next, what diet their friend tried that was really successful for them. And it's sort of become a really normal thing in our society to be on a diet or to be coming off of a diet or planning to go on a diet. And so this is what I mean by diet culture. It's become really normal and normalized to sort of always be on a diet or often be on a diet. And you can see my little figure. Eat all of the foods. That's the medicine. It's incorporating everything. So diet culture really idealizes thinness. It really equates being thin with being healthy, being virtuous. Diet culture encourages a lot of investment of time and money in the pursuit of this ideal. Let's think about who profits from that, right? Diet culture really emphasizes that there are right and wrong ways of eating. There's not a lot of balance in that. You're either doing it right or you've made a mistake, right? You're on a good diet and you're doing it the right way, or you've done it wrong. And diet culture also really contributes to the oppression of already marginalized groups. So, a few examples of diet culture: labeling foods. This is junk food. This is clean food. This is healthy food. Associating worth with how you eat, right? If I eat in a really clean way or a really healthy way, then it means I'm really good and I can feel really proud of myself. If I trip up and I eat a bag of chips that was on my not good list, then I must be a really bad person and I should be really ashamed of myself. Diet culture really emphasizes ignoring body cues, right? We're not really cueing into what our body needs or what it's asking for. We're sort of saying, okay, these are the rules, I need to follow them, right? Without regard to maybe what we're experiencing internally and how that might inform actually what we should be eating. It's really common to eliminate food groups in thinking about diets. There's lots of food rules. There's lots of anxiety that comes up. What if this food isn't available? When people get really rigid about the foods that they're eating, it becomes really hard for them to eat in social contexts, right? Going to a social event, going to a friend's house creates a lot of anxiety because what if they don't have a food that I can eat there? And then what am I going to do? And then, well, what if they only have pizza and I can't eat pizza? And then people are going to be asking me, why aren't you eating anything? And then I'm going to have to lie and say, oh, I already ate before, right? So it creates this really intense anxiety about how they're going to manage themselves in different types of social situations that might demand something from them. Unless the situation that they're going to is one in which a lot of people are engaging in diet culture, then it becomes normal, like, oh, there's pizza, we're not going to eat that, right? And then that sort of encourages everybody else to say, oh, I guess I shouldn't eat that because nobody else is eating it, so I shouldn't enjoy that either. Exercise is often used for punishment in kind of this diet culture. So if you eat something bad or unhealthy, then you have to exercise to make up for it, versus moving your body because it feels good. Moving your body because you enjoy the movement, because it feels nice to get outside and go for a run, or to dance with a friend or whatever. It kind of takes the joy out of a lot of these things. Diet talk, lots of diet talk. The scale really being an indicator of what you're worth. So seeing that number as being a number that you're striving for, and seeing it on the scale, that means I'm good, I'm doing a good job, I'm worthwhile, I'm worthy. Or conversely, if that number is bad or too high, or it went up, even if it just went up 0.1 pound, for some people that their whole day is ruined. And then now they can't stop thinking about what they're going to do, because how could I have gained weight, and I've been working so hard and I must be doing something wrong, right? So there's lots of things that are encompassed in diet culture. I want to give people some examples and ideas about what this looks like, because it's become so common in our society for this type of thinking to become normalized and talked about, that sometimes it's kind of hard to step back from that and say, what are we doing, and how helpful is this? And is this the way that I want to be thinking about food, or is this the way I want to be communicating about diet and body and eating, in my family? But it's really hard because everybody else is oftentimes really bought into this diet culture. So this is maybe a point where you might be experiencing some dissonance, some feeling of like, this is really different than the way that I think about these things. Or, gosh, but that just feels like such a normal way to be. Of course we want to focus on healthy foods. Of course our family wants to try to provide nutritious food within our home. And yes, all of that is true. And I'm not trying to challenge any part of that. And I think it's really easy for us and for kids to become really rigid around how they think about then what is healthy and what's okay. And I think that's where we get into sometimes some problems, and can put people in a situation where they feel like they can no longer enjoy maybe some of these foods that they used to enjoy, that they probably shouldn't be enjoying all day, every day, but that should be a part of their diet in general. Okay. So yeah, dieting has become normalized, but it really is, it's not a normal way of eating. And again, this may challenge some of your thoughts about diets, and that's okay. And if you have questions, I'll answer them. But generally, we know that diets don't work. So they're actually more likely to cause weight gain in the long term than weight loss. Only about 5% of people who go on a diet end up keeping off that weight in the long term. So there's so much investment in people going on diets and trying to improve their health and trying to lose weight. And actually what we see when we follow people over time who have been dieting is that they're not improving their health. Generally, they can keep the weight off for a period of time. And then over time, we see that their weight kind of goes back. And usually not just back to where they were before, but even above where they had typically tracked for weight. And then they might go on another diet because they gained too much weight. And then they might even go above where they had gained weight before. So there's not a lot of great scientific evidence to support a lot of the claims that we see out there about diets. And again, thinking about diets as something that is kind of a short-term way of eating, this is really different than kind of a lifestyle change that's sustainable, right? So if people make changes that are really sustainable over time, where they don't feel super restricted, which is part of what makes it an eating pattern sustainable, that's a little bit of a different story. But most diets generally aren't designed that way. Most people kind of go on and off of them. And for the most part, it's really hard to sustain the weight loss that people achieve in a diet. Dieting is also one of the most powerful predictors of disordered eating, and one of the strongest risk factors for eating disorders. So it's one of the reasons why we think so much about it. We also think about diets as being really harmful for a variety of reasons. One is that people can develop pretty significant nutrition deficiencies. It can result in injury. It can result in lower immunity. We see lower rates of immunity in the patients who we see with eating disorders, and especially with COVID, we were especially careful because their bodies are not equipped to really fight off infections in the same way that somebody who is well nourished is able to. Again, this is a preventable kind of precursor to developing an eating disorder. So we really try to teach kids when we go to schools, when we talk to young people, talk to high schoolers, we really try to talk to them about kind of healthy eating habits, regular eating habits, not going for long periods of time without eating, not cutting out total food groups altogether, trying to kind of buck up against this really common pattern that dieting is this normal and okay thing to do, because it's actually really pretty harmful. And especially for teens who are in that critical time period of development where they are more susceptible potentially to developing an eating disorder, we really try to emphasize across eating disorders, regular eating, balanced eating, no food's kind of good or bad. All foods are okay in their proper balance and moderation. Okay, so what else is wrong with diets? The other thing that comes up with diets that we see is this kind of really vicious cycle. So you go on a diet, the diet says, you need to cut down on oils. You can't eat any fried foods. You can't eat any carbs. So bread is out, and it becomes a very restrictive pattern of eating. What ends up happening? The person on the diet feels kind of deprived because that's not a normal way of eating, and they're following all these rules, and they're seeing what other people are having, and well, now I can't have a sandwich because I can't have bread. And God, I kind of want one of my friend's chips that they just offered me, but I can't take it. So all of this level of self-control that you have to do to engage in a diet leads people to feel really deprived. What happens when we feel deprived? I think you probably all know from personal experience, most people have a certain amount of self-control that they can exercise, and that goes across the board. If you're using a lot of it up for food, you're not going to have as much of it for other things that you're going to need to exercise self-control about. But it is a set quantity. We don't have unlimited self-control. And so when you are feeling deprived and you're having to exercise a lot of self-control around dieting, we can be overwhelmed with this urge to eat. Like, I can't do this anymore. I've sort of reached my limit. So you become overwhelmed with this urge to eat. And then that leads to people to engage in binging. And part of this is psychological, just the psychological impact of knowing that you shouldn't eat something is going to make you more likely to have the urge and end up eating it, and eating it in a portion much bigger than you would had you just included it in a normal quantity in your kind of everyday diet. But it's also a physiological drive because you may not be taking in as much nutrition and energy as what your body really requires to do its day-to-day activities. And that sets you up for a binge because your body's trying to compensate and say, what happened? I need energy and you're not giving it to me. So I'm going to overrule your behavior by really driving you to, go and seek out this, highly dense, highly palatable food because your body needs it. And you're obviously not making the decision to get that. Then after the binge, people generally feel really out of control. They feel like they can't stop. Sometimes they go from one thing to the next. Maybe they had only planned to eat, some of the ice cream, and then they're kind of at the end, and it's like, well, what the hell? I already ate all of this, so why don't I just finish it? So it kind of leads to this, really black and white thinking about eating. And then the amount of guilt and shame that comes in for people afterwards, especially when they've had a really specific rule around not eating that particular type of food or not eating after a certain time of day or whatever rule they might have broken, causes a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. And then that guilt and shame sort of drives them to, well, I'm going to re-up my diet tomorrow. Today everything is ruined, so I might as well go and see what else is in the pantry. But tomorrow I'm going to restart my diet, right? And then that diet cycle continues. So diets can really increase our preoccupation with food. We're thinking a lot about, all these forbidden foods that we're not allowed to have. That sense of deprivation actually ends up leading us to overeat, and sometimes binge eat, where you not just overeat, but you experience a real loss of control over food. And then that sort of starts the whole restriction cycle all over again. Okay, so, diets really reinforceth an ideal that this is something that we should all be striving for, rather than striving for health, right? Because we know to some extent that size is not equated with health. And actually some of the lowest mortality rates are in people of somewhat higher weight, not the people who are very, very thin. So, but that's not how we think about, I think, in kind of our culture. It's not really how we think about quote unquote health. I'm just going to put that out there to challenge us all a little bit. Diets really moralize food. Food become good or bad, healthy or unhealthy. We're either virtuous or not virtuous, depending on what foods we choose to eat. Really kind of makes us distrust our own bodies and our own cues in a way that is not helpful. When you, again, kind of going back to infancy and toddlerhood, toddlers eat unencumbered. They enjoy food. Food ends up all over the place. They don't feel self-conscious about their bodies. They just walk around however. They have not been socialized to this way of thinking about their bodies that ends up causing so much distress for so many people. And it's such a beautiful thing to see toddlers like that. They're just enjoying the food that they have, and they're just whatever about their body. And I think as we get older, we move further and further away from being able to tune into those cues that for toddlers come a lot more naturally. And sometimes as parents drive us kind of crazy because, we might be thinking, well, they haven't had enough, or, oh my gosh, they're eating so much. But they're really responding to what their body is needing. Maybe they're, gearing up for a growth spurt. And so they need all of that extra nutrition. And then whoosh, then you see that they go through this huge growth spurt, and you understand finally why they were eating so much. Or other periods of time where they're really not eating what we think is sufficient, where we're sort of, there's sort of an impulse to push them. Like, you only had 2 bites of your whatever, chicken, you need to have another bite before we leave the table. All of these things sort of teach us that we can't really trust our own bodies to tell us what to do, right? And so that's another way that the diet kind of plays a role, is it's basically telling you what you should be doing. And when we think about intuitive eating, and that's often something that we strive for in young people that we're working with, is for them ultimately to get to a point where they actually can trust their body again. But because they've spent so much time kind of messing with their body's cues, their body stops giving them the cues that they need to be successful. So we can't really rely on those cues for a while. But ultimately, we really hope that people get to a place where they can eat in an intuitive way and really listen to their body when they feel extra hungry, whether or not they know why, but they're able to respond to that. Okay. So, you know what, maybe let me go back for a second. And I want to give everybody maybe 2 minutes to just reflect on maybe some of your own beliefs or beliefs that you hear kind of in your social circles about diets, about diet culture, about body size, and think about some of the ones that you have bought into or that feel really important, or that you have really been a part of how you were kind of raised, and beliefs that really feel strong to you. And just think about maybe some of the influences on that. And if you're at home and you're with somebody that you want to talk to about it, feel free. If you want to keep this kind of private for yourself, you can jot down some thoughts or just think a little bit kind of on your own. But sometimes it can be helpful to just take a moment. I presented a lot of information about diets and diet culture and attitudes, and sometimes this is really different than what people have heard in the past, or the some of the beliefs or thoughts that you have had about what health looks like. So I want to give people just a couple of minutes to just reflect, and maybe think about how some of these things fit or don't, or things that you're curious about that maybe would be good conversation for discussion at the end. And That'll give me a chance to drink a little bit of water. Okay. So obviously this may be something that you continue to think about after today, or that you may bring to friends or family for discussion around. But some of these beliefs are so ingrained in our society, they're so normalized in our culture, that sometimes when I present this information, it's kind of challenging for people to take in. So I encourage you, if there are things that maybe don't feel right to you or are surprising to you, or that sort of challenge maybe your way of thinking about them, to just take some time and think about where those beliefs came from, and how helpful ultimately they are. Are they working for you? Is it helpful for you? Is it helpful for your family? Or maybe there may be some things that you start to look at in a different way, or start to question. I welcome questions and openness about thinking about these things. Okay. So some ways to fight diet culture, it's just really focusing on what your body can do rather than what it looks like. So my legs can run a mile without stopping, right? That feels good. Or my legs got me, from the parking lot to this room. And that's a really cool thing that my body's able to do. Avoiding harmful forms of media. We're seeing a lot, especially over the course of the pandemic. This really became teens' way of connecting with each other. And for young adults who were super isolated in college or after, not able to attend school or working from home, etc., not really being in the classroom with other kids, social media became an even more important way for people to be connected. And there were some ways in which that was really helpful and really positive. There were also some ways in which they may have kind of gone down a path of, thinking about body comparisons or health or, whatever, and followed some people on social media that were maybe not super positive influences in terms of them developing really healthy habits. So trying to help create an environment where our kids are not getting so wrapped up in social media that may not really be helpful for them. Doing some extra learning on different types of health and what that can look like, and knowing that health is not totally equated with size, but really it's equated with, our capacity to do things, and our different vital signs that and labs that your doctors can take. But size itself is not really a marker of health, and we often think that it is. But it's a very, very problematic way of thinking about health. And not labeling foods as good or bad, right? Some foods might be more for joy. This is a food that we eat because it's a really fun food, right? Or this is a food that we eat because we're celebrating. And this is one of the ways that our family celebrates, right, is sharing a cake. This is a food that we eat because it has really good nutrition and vitamin for our bodies and helps you be really strong and do the kinds of things that you want to do. But not putting them in this good and bad category, that all foods are okay, and all foods have different uses, and some of them some of those uses may be different, and that's okay too. Okay. The other thing that I want to really emphasize is that a lot of the risk factors that I've talked about so far can be changed. So this negative energy balance that we talked about, frequent dieting, these are behaviors that can be changed. It's not always easy if you're concerned about your child and they've really kind of gone down a path of whatever it is that they're pursuing, health or weight loss or whatever. It's not always that easy to convince them about making some of these changes, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. But these are changeable risk factors. People are really dissatisfied with their body image. This is something that we know how to help people with, and that kids can get help with. And oftentimes when they're so distressed about their bodies, most kids don't want to be. Most kids would rather to be happy with their body, especially if they've gotten to a place of realizing that they're not necessarily going to be effective in changing it. That's usually when we would really start to work on body image. If not, and they're really actively working on changing it, we would focus more on the behaviors and trying to normalize those first. Personality traits like perfectionism, low self-esteem, or really rigid types of thinking, these are all things that we can have an impact on, right? Helping kids to be more flexible in thinking about what should be, right? Being perfect isn't necessarily always the best way to be. We help kids make mistakes on purpose. They have a really hard time with this, but this is a way to help them practice getting out of this idea that they, quote unquote, have to be perfect to be worthwhile or valued. So we help kids, practice making mistakes, to, not getting the 100 on the test, different ways for them to be more flexible. We find ways to increase their self-esteem, especially ways that are not tied to their body image. If that is a big part of why they feel low about themselves, and they've put a lot of eggs in that basket in terms of, what makes them feel valued as a person, we help them think outside of that. So what is their role in their family, and is that important to them? What about their role as a friend within their peers, and how is that important to them? What about activities that they do that are important to them? For some kids, being a sibling is something that's really important to them, and so they devote more time to that. So we try to really work on ways to expand outside of maybe how they think about themselves when it becomes really focused on eating and body image. And then rigid thinking, again, we help kids to think about how to be more flexible in terms of their thinking, and to experiment with a little bit with different ways of doing things, to realize, oh, actually that felt pretty good, and I don't have to be so regimented about how I do things. I can sort of tolerate being able to do things in this gray area, which maybe not as comfortable for me, but it's maybe kind of nice that I don't have to always do things exactly the same way. And then there is a lot of exposure, especially now, and again, like I said, especially kind of over the course of the pandemic, to really negative images about, food and body, and kind of the culture that's developed around this. I think in the pandemic especially, we saw a lot of young people coming into the hospital who sort of felt like they didn't really have a lot to do with their time because they were home from school, and they needed to kind of make something worthwhile of their time. And so some of them put all of that energy into becoming healthier. And, obviously that became kind of the snowball starts rolling down the hill. All of a sudden they realize they can't stop it. And they never intended to take it to that length. But I think some of these various factors, if we can start a conversation, develop a little bit of openness around it, reduce some of the exposure to some of these negative messages, or try to counteract those messages within the home. And if those things really aren't taking an impact, then thinking about getting some extra support, because, there are a lot of risk factors that can be changed, and I think parents are the best place to start for that. But it's not always easy to know exactly how to do that. And so if you're feeling really stuck in knowing exactly what next steps to take, it can be helpful to get some consultation or some professional help. Okay, so some principles around what we hope parents will take away is, especially when your child has this capacity, to trust that they actually do have this innate capacity to self-regulate, right? And I think oftentimes with younger kids, we try to interfere a lot with food because we want to make sure they're getting enough. We want to make sure that they're getting the right things. And sometimes all of that intervention can cause kids to feel like, I sort of need help with what to do, and maybe I don't really know what I need to eat. And if people have been engaging in a lot of dieting behavior or a lot of rules around eating, they do sort of lose that capacity to self-regulate. So I want to be really careful with this one. If someone has lost a lot of weight or they're engaging in really frequent binge eating, then sometimes that capacity to self-regulate needs to be corrected, and they need extra help around that. So I'm not saying just go ahead and trust your child. They're going to do whatever they need to do. When someone has progressed along, disordered eating, or they've developed a full eating disorder, they may have lost that ability to self-regulate. But we do believe that everybody has it and can get it back, that we all have this innate ability to know what's needed, and that we can kind of relearn those cues over time. Trying to refrain from using food as a bribe or as a punishment. Sometimes we think about food as something that is, it's so appealing that it's really easy as kind of a reward, or trying to get, kids to do something that we want them to do. You can have dessert, but only if you finish your broccoli first, right? This actually creates really kind of different beliefs for people around food that may not in the end be so helpful for them. Or, if you don't clean up the dishes, no more cookies. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be some natural consequences within the house if you need to get certain things done or ask somebody to do something. But in general, if you can try to keep food out of that equation, it'll help people to not feel that food is tied to any sort of value, which can be problematic. And then try to avoid restricting access to certain foods. So we know that when this happens, certain foods are off limit, or they're only allowed at certain times, and it's much more regimented. Sometimes this can be associated with people eating in the absence of hunger, that they end up eating when they don't actually need to be eating, or they're more dissatisfied with their bodies. Restrictive eating disorders are also associated with feeling like they weren't allowed to access certain foods when they wanted to. Again, I think there are a lot of good reasons why we don't want kids to have unlimited access to all foods, right? And that's normal, and it makes sense. And but I think when it becomes really, really extreme, then kids can sort of stop. They lose their capacity to regulate themselves. And so what we also want to be teaching them are these skills, so that when they're not at home anymore, that they sort of have their own internal ways of helping to manage their access to food, right? And that we know that they can trust themselves to say, I'm not going to have this today or that today or this at this meal. But I'm going to this, event later on, and I bet there's going to be cake, and that'll be, fun, and I'll be able to enjoy that there. And that it's not really something that they're having to think about or plan a lot in advance. But when we start to intervene and create lots of rules around food and when it can be accessed, sometimes this can become a little bit more challenging for young people to manage on their own. We really want to try to encourage young people to eat a wide range of food. Prepared in new ways, prepared in different ways. Try to find preparations that your child really likes. Present it really consistently. Try to praise them when they're open to trying new things. Trying new things is great. The more restrictive someone becomes in their eating habits, the more we worry about potential risk for an eating disorder. So, and especially if you have, one of these kids who might be a little bit pickier, might be a little bit more selective in what they eat, or especially if they have a lot of different allergies that get in the way of them eating a lot of different types of foods, this can be really challenging because they may not be very open to wanting to try new things, or there may be certain things that are just off limits for them altogether. So if you can find ways to try to expand within what's possible for them, the range of foods with some of the young people who we see with more picky eating, sometimes these are really small changes. They might like a certain type of bar, but only this particular flavor. I mean, sometimes it's literally the same flavor of bar with a different brand, or the same brand of bar, but with a different flavor. They can be really small changes, or a little bit of a shift in how something is prepared. The more we can help kids experience new and more varied ways of eating food, the better they are able to cope with different types of factors that may come up, or different types of situations where they may not have access to something that's familiar for them. And we really want for kids to be able to eat across lots of different types of settings and new types of situations. We work with some people who travel is really a core value for them and something that they really enjoy, but they know that they won't be able to eat enough of the foods in another country where they want to go the way that they're currently eating. And so then that can be a motivator for, okay, what are some of the things that we need to practice, and how can we help you really expand the variety of foods that you're eating so that you can go to Italy and enjoy everything that's there. And when you stay with the host family, you don't have to feel self-conscious or weird because you won't be able to eat what they've presented you with. Remember that our bodies are really smart, and every day is going to look different. So our bodies are equipped to get the nutrients that we need over the course of days, sometimes weeks. So every day is not going to look the same. Some days may be heavier in nutrition, some days may not be. Some days may be heavier in certain types of nutrients or vitamins, and other days may be lower in those. But over the course of several days or over the course of weeks, if we follow some of these principles, our bodies are really smart. They're able to figure this out for the most part, unless, again, there is something external that's coming into play, or some of our kids with more picky eating that we work with who, they really do struggle to get all of the nutrients that they need, and then we're really focusing on helping them with that. Allowing kids to be involved in cooking and with serving food, it's fun. If they're involved in doing it, especially if you have a child who might be a little bit pickier, involving them in the preparation of things can be a really nice way of getting them involved and interested and kind of more engaged with what they're making. I think they're more likely to eat it if they're engaged in the preparation. I would say this is somewhat different in the context of an eating disorder that's developed, where if someone really has an eating disorder where they have certain rules, then actually them being in the kitchen can be much more stressful and actually unhelpful, because they're going to, what's that oil that you're putting? Oh my God, you put too much oil. And so, in the context of an eating disorder and treatment, we often say, keep the kids out of the kitchen because it's too stressful for you, it's too stressful for them. But ultimately, we really hope that they can get back to the kitchen and be able to prepare the foods in the way that would be kind of a normal, healthy preparation of foods that might be typical for your family. So this one's a little bit different depending on, where your child is. But if it's healthy for them to be involved in the cooking and preparation of food, that's great. And if they have any interest in that, really try to involve them in that. And then the other thing, I think oftentimes in kind of pediatric checks, or depending on what physician your child sees for their kind of regular checkups, sometimes weight and BMI can be an important topic that comes up in that. And physicians, I think, take a really different slant on how they approach these conversations. But I think if you can help to advocate for your child and say, I'd rather we not really talk about specific numbers or weight, but rather markers of health, that can be a really helpful shift. Because in the end, what we're really shooting for is health for our children, right? And the number is not really a terribly reliable indicator of health. So if there are concerns about eating patterns, let's talk about those behaviors. If there are concerns about someone's, levels of a certain factor, well, let's talk about that. And let's talk about the types of behaviors that can help to improve those markers. But talking about weight as a number, we hear this from a lot of the young people who we see who come in. My pediatrician told me I was overweight, told me I needed to lose weight. I went on this diet, and now I'm here. And now you're telling me I need to gain weight, and I don't want to do that. And that's not what my pediatrician told me to do. So again, there's all of these conversations are well-meaning, and all of them are intended to really help improve health. But I think if we can stay away from discussing numbers explicitly as something that we need to change, or discussing BMI as something that we need to change, but rather really focusing on health behaviors. It's a much more helpful shift for kids to make. I should be getting exercise in this type of way and doing movement that I enjoy in this way versus I need to exercise now because I need to lose weight and I need to check what my weight is. And then it becomes this really regimented kind of unhealthy type of pattern behavior. Really practicing body respect. So when you're hearing weight or shape-based bullying or you're hearing fat talk, interrupting that. This is really common in peer groups. This is really common among our adult groups, parent groups. You'll hear this stuff come up. I'm sure this is part of all of our conversations. Some people talk about this more than others, but there is a lot of discussion about people's body size, body shape. There is a lot of fat talk. There is a lot of bullying, especially in high schools, around this. And there's pretty significant weight bias where many studies have been done. People who are at higher weights are treated differently, both in the healthcare setting as well as kind of in social settings. And I think we can all reflect on whatever your values are kind of, around this and how you would like to respond when these topics come up or how you want to kind of contribute to this conversation. But it is actually really normal for us to have a range of sizes. That's actually normal. People aren't all meant to be at the median or all meant to be kind of average or all meant to be lean. That's really not how that's not normal. Normal is for there to be a range around different body sizes and shapes. And so we can help to normalize that people of different shapes, people of different sizes, people of different abilities, people of different skin colors, all are okay. And yet that's maybe not kind of the predominant way that people think and talk about some of these topics. So practicing body respect in the sense of, if you hear some of these things and it doesn't sit right with you, or it's maybe not the kind of messaging that you want in your family, it's not the kind of messaging that you want your child to be internalizing, you can actually help to kind of shift that conversation. And all of us have probably engaged in this also. So I also put that out there that not for people to feel ashamed or bad if you've bought into some of these ideas or if you've engaged in some of this behavior yourself, but thinking about whether that's something that is, again, helpful in your family, something that you want to continue, or something that you want to shift in terms of how you think and talk about some of these topics. Just remembering that weight and BMI is actually not a very good predictor of health, and really trying to refocus our energy on supporting growth, supporting development for each individual's body type. I think one of the things that young people and also their parents struggle quite a bit with when they see us and their child has developed an eating disorder, and maybe they've lost a very significant amount of weight. Maybe that child was on kind of the higher end of the weight spectrum, maybe within the normal range, but still on the higher end. And they've lost weight, and they've probably gotten a lot of compliments about that weight loss, right? You look so good. Oh my gosh, you've lost so much weight. You're doing so well. The pediatrician might be thrilled with their progress. Maybe they're at the 50th percentile, which is what we would think of as kind of average, kind of median weight, right in the middle. Although that's not totally true because they haven't updated the BMI growth charts in a long time. So that's like average from a long time ago. Our body sizes, as in a general rule, have kind of gotten larger over time. But to the outside person, they may not appear malnourished or underweight, or it may not appear that there's a problem. And yet, if that person had been tracking on the higher end of the weight scale, let's say they were at the 80th BMI percentile, and that's always where they were, from the time they were 2 to the time they were 4 to the time they were 14 to the time that they turned 18, that they were really tracking along that growth curve, we really see that as good evidence that that is where their body's meant to be. And even though 50th percentile may be sort of average, it wasn't average for them. And we don't often see some of the psychopathology, some of the distress, some of the cognitive symptoms, the thinking that goes along with eating disorders. We don't often see that improve unless we get people back to the trajectory that they were on before. So just encouraging people to be really flexible with this idea that everybody's body is different. We're actually all meant to be different. And we actually need to respect, our child may have a different growth pattern than other children in our family or than we have. But that is actually where their body is meant to be and where their body is healthy. And so when we're working with people who have developed an eating disorder, we really focus on getting them back to their prior trajectory. And knowing that we have weight bias and fat talk and diet culture and all of these things, it's not always easy to support people at a weight where that maybe they do experience some, teasing or bullying or discrimination. And we know from a medical perspective and from a psychological perspective that helping them get back on their growth curve is actually one of the best things that we can do for their recovery. But our body composition is largely genetically determined. And so if we're trying to battle against that with different types of diets, people are generally not successful. Like I said, they may lose weight for a period of time. Unless they're kind of predisposed to develop anorexia, people usually can't maintain that weight loss. And if they are predisposed to developing anorexia, we don't want them to stay at that weight because it's not healthy for them. It really drives this problematic pattern of thinking and behavior that can be really disabling for people if it goes on for a long time. So where you can, trying to model positive body image, right? It's not really so much focused on what we look like, but being comfortable in our own skin to the extent that, this is something that all of us can continually practice. It's not easy to do that, but we can model thinking about the things that our body is able to do for us and being okay with that because it's just one aspect of our identity. It doesn't define who we are. And our bodies enable us to do lots of different things. And so really focus on our capacity to do those things versus what size we are. And then really focusing on moving for fun, for joy, for feeling good about ourselves, not thinking about I have to exercise because, I have this rule around exercise, or I have to exercise because of X, Y, and Z reason. Exercise is healthy. Of course, we all want to engage in healthy activity, but also it should be fun, right? And certain activities are more fun for us. And so if we focus on doing those types of activities, or, you might be engaging in activity because it's what you can do given limited time. And that's okay too. But again, focusing on movement for things that really benefit us versus because we're supposed to or because we have to or we have these rules around these things. All of these things are really positive modeling for kids. And again, all of us are exposed to all of these pretty fixed ways of thinking often about food and exercise and body size, etc. So it's not easy to make some of these changes or to think about how you might implement some of these changes, but even small things that you might want to shift that might feel good to you to take a different stance on or might feel really good for you to do differently can make a big difference, both for just how you feel, but also really positive modeling for your family. Some of the ways that we might think about responding to fat talk or diet talk, you can say things like, your body is really smart and it actually knows what it needs, right? Or all bodies are different. All bodies are unique. This is the way your body was made. This is the way my body was made. We don't really have control over that, actually. That's kind of genetics. Or your body knows what it needs to be the shape and size that's just right for you, right? So it's conveying this level of trust in young people and their capacity to manage these things, themselves, or know what their body is supposed to do and how that's supposed to feel. Okay, so let's talk about some early warning signs for eating disorders. When you see really rigid rules around eating, only eating healthy foods or not eating any carbs or no sugar, these are some of the early warning signs that you may observe. If you see your child skipping meals or ignoring their hunger cues, that's a concerning sign. If your child is eating past the point of fullness, they've really had enough, but they can't stop. And that's really happening on a recurrent basis. All of us do this sometimes, right? all of us sort of eat past the point of when we're full. You think about Thanksgiving, that's a time when most of the society in our country is often eating past the point of fullness, right? They're the foods that you maybe only have Thanksgiving. They're special. You really want to enjoy them. That's actually normative. But if this is happening on a recurrent, ongoing basis, that's cause for concern. If kids are feeling really guilty about eating or after eating, that's a cause for concern, kind of one of the early warning signs that we think about. Or if they're trying to, after eating, really compensate for what they ate, or kind of negate eating by exercising, by purging in some way, taking diet pills or laxatives, exercising really hard, engaging in vomiting behavior, that's also cause for concern. How am I doing on time?
We're getting really close on time.
Okay.
And it would be great to stop and soon and take a couple of questions if we could.
Let's do that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so, you all have these slides, I think, so you can take a look at some of the later warning signs as well. We get concerned about medical complications, and also some of the really strong emotional and cognitive consequences that happen, people feeling really bad about themselves. I think the most important thing is to ask, if you're concerned about your child, to what extent is this affecting their functioning or causing them a lot of distress or resulting in some physical health consequences that you're seeing? And if you're seeing any of those things, then it is probably a good time for you to reach out for some extra support. Okay, so with that said, love to just take any questions. And there are a lot of resources in the handouts that I passed out, so hopefully those are resources that you can refer back to. But
all right, let's give a warm round of applause for Dr. Accurso. Thank you so much for helping us learn about this important topic. So now we'd like to open up the floor to any questions anyone may have. For those of you that are joining us virtually, you can enter your questions in the Q&A panel, and we'll repeat those questions so everyone can hear it, and Dr. Accurso can respond to your questions. So is there anybody in the room that has a question to start with?
Hey, thank you very much. That was, is this working? Yes. Okay, thank you very much. That was very, very informative. I was just curious, over the last 20 years or so, with the really explosion of social media, if you've seen big trends that have changed, in other words, patterns of behavior that might have occurred in elementary schools or middle schools that are, have completely died off, but new patterns that have now picked up because of this social media thing that has completely taken over our world.
yeah, I mean, I think it's not uncommon for us to see kids engaging in certain behaviors because they learned about them on social media, or these things are being talked about, and so it's more in their mind of, oh, this person is doing that, I should try that, or I follow this person and they're engaging in this behavior. And so it looks really normal because a lot of people may be talking about these things on social media. So yes, absolutely. I think we see that a lot. And we try to be really mindful about what sites people are visiting or how they're using social media, because when they've become really entrenched in a certain site or following a certain person, it becomes really normalized, and they sort of think that it is normal. And then we sort of hear what they're saying, and we realize, like, oh wow, they've really bought into this idea. So absolutely, I think it's become a big thing that we're paying more and more attention to. But I've also seen it work the opposite way, where there are actually these communities who are really recovery oriented, and some kids get really into those. And, they're sharing, kind of their success stories. Like, I ate this food today that I was terrified to eat, that I refused to eat in the hospital, but I did it today and I was so proud of myself. So I think social media can work in both ways, but we are seeing a lot, especially on the development side, of it being used in a really negative way, unfortunately.
Wow. This is amazing. I have a lot to change. Just to be honest, it's great.
You know what? Remembering self-compassion, we all do.
Right?
We all do. It's a continual process for all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was interesting when you were talking about binging versus, having a hard time getting a child to eat. I have a son who's on ADHD meds, And it's either very hard to get him to eat, and then when the meds wear off, he really needs the food and he's binging, and you're trying to make the right choices for him.
Right.
How do I guide him as he's just hitting puberty and we're going into high school and that too? Just kind of be aware, I don't know, or not be aware.
You know, with teenage boys, it's so unpredictable what they need, and sometimes the amount of nutrition that is normal for them to intake is astounding, right? And so I think having some humility about the fact that, like, we don't necessarily know what they need, but especially if their appetite has been suppressed, you know, being on Adderall or, you know, any other ADHD medication. And if you're not concerned about kind of disordered eating in that way, that may be his chance to recover some of the kind of eating and nutrition that he's missed out on over the course of being on the medication. So if he were to take a break over the summer or whatever, my guess is that there would be an initial kind of burst of eating behavior that would probably normalize over the course of several months. I think it's more important to tune into, is he feeling distressed about the eating? Or does it feel really out of control for him? And if it does, then maybe that's something to think about and talk about. But I also know teen boys can sometimes go for really long periods of time without eating because they're engaged in whatever they're engaged in. And then they're voracious, you know, and then they come home and they eat the whole kitchen because they're so hungry. And so helping to kind of develop some structure around food can also be really helpful, right? If he's sleeping in until 10, then he's already kind of behind for the day by the time he wakes up. So, you know, even if he wakes up and just has a small breakfast and goes back to bed or whatever, you know, setting kids up on a more regular pattern of eating kind of regularly throughout the day. Most kids need 3 meals and 3 snacks, you know, regardless of, you know, their need to gain or lose or whatever weight. So if you can help to kind of set some of those regular times in place, that may also help to regulate some of that like super strong drive that he may have for food. But I would try to trust what his body feels like he needs. Unless you're seeing some of those concerns around, like, he's feeling really distressed about the eating, then maybe it's a good chance to check in and say, you know, well, are you feeling hungry and you're kind of eating past that point? Or are you just feeling hungry and you're just meeting that need? And maybe we can help you kind of slow down so your body has a chance to catch up. So you won't know immediately if you feel full, if you kind of keep eating past that point, but maybe we can kind of maybe also focusing on some more dense foods. So the volume doesn't feel so overwhelming. If he's really hungry, he might really need some of those, you know, denser foods with more fats and more proteins.
Thanks for your excellent presentation. To amplify on Dr. Alfrey's point, I like to play the game Words with Friends with others, and there are these advertisements for these gummies that Oprah and Adele have used successfully to lose what looks like 90 pounds in a month. Yeah. They're so convincing, I've thought of buying them myself. But I'm just curious, what are these gummies, and what is the regulation about? Why are people being exposed to these ads?
Why are people being exposed is a great question. But I think it comes back to diet culture, right? It's sought after in our culture and common for people to strive for weight loss. But so far, we really haven't found, you know, what works, quote unquote. But yeah, there are a lot of new drugs that are out there, and some of them we really don't have any information about the long-term effects. So especially for young people, we become really concerned if they're kind of testing the waters with things, because we don't know how that's going to affect long-term their hormones, their, you know, metabolism, their overall regulation. They're dangerous. Anything that's new, I generally, unless there's a ton of long-term data on its use, it's just, yeah. But why is it being advertised? Because everybody's seeking that magical solution, right? It's yet to be found, and it's not a solution that I buy into, I guess.
Okay, I've got a question for you from our virtual audience. Is the USDA food pyramid still a good planning tool for proper nutrition, or is there a more up-to-date model?
That's a great question. I would say I don't love the USDA food pyramid, honestly. Even the way that it's organized sort of creates a hierarchy around food, right? Certain foods being more valuable at the bottom, like in the green, that you should be getting lots of, and certain foods being at the top in the red, like limit these foods. I think there's a plate model that's out there that I like much better. That sort of says, about this much of your plate should be this type of food, and about this much of your plate should be that type of food, and but it includes everything on the plate in kind of equal value. I like that model a bit better because it doesn't put this hierarchy of what the right foods are. But yes, I mean, obviously in general, we should be taking in higher levels of things with fiber, fruits and vegetables. Those are great for nutrition. But also there should be some kind of carb on the plate. Carbs aren't evil or bad. We can have a slice of bread with some olive oil or butter. That's actually an important part of the meal and shouldn't be something that gets put on a certain rank of the pyramid, I guess. So there's a plate model. If I can find it and I can share it, maybe that can be sent out afterwards.
The California Department of Public Health actually has the My Plate on their website.
That's great.
So I
Thank you.
encourage people to check there.
Perfect.
One more question. I've been hearing a lot about intermittent fasting, and it's showing up in my Facebook feed. What are your thoughts about intermittent fasting? And is this a good thing? Is just the latest fad that we should be concerned about?
This one is a really tricky one for me to answer because with my eating disorders hat on, it's not a great thing to engage in. It puts people at increased this dieting behavior puts people at increased risk for eating disorder development or disordered eating. And you sort of don't always know whether you have the loaded gun, so to speak, with your genetics and biology. So to me, engaging in that kind of dieting behavior is risky. That said, it's hard to contradict the data that there are some benefits to engaging in this type of, intermittent fasting. I just personally, I don't subscribe to giving that a try because to me it feels very risky. It's not a normal way of eating, and I think the long-term data are probably still out on that.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Accurso. This was just a fabulous presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. I wish we had had more time for questions. I sort of got off by a half hour, but
That's okay.
hopefully if
No
people want to
worries.
follow up, they're welcome to do so.
It was just terrific.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you for those who are attending at home as well. Have a great evening.